very warm welcome once again and to this wonderful panel here. This is a conversation on wealth creation, but during this session, we want to correlate wealth creation with the broader economy. And our panel of experienced economists has a pulse both of Bharat and of India. And the big question that is being debated, and the data also points towards that, is the shape of India's recovery. Because the shape of India's recovery, all of you who are here and our viewers, is very significant to this debate. Post the pandemic, the shape of India's recovery, some people argue, is a K-shaped recovery. Some others say it is a W-shaped recovery. So with this panel, what we are going to try and first understand is the shape of the recovery, and therefore in terms of wealth creation, investment ideas. I'll not ask the economists for ideas. For that we have a wonderful panel that is going to come up next, and we have speakers like Sunil Singhania here for that. I'll start with you first, Aurodeep. What is the shape of India's recovery, the post-pandemic recovery?
I mean, Siddharth, you make a very important point that you should not leave economists alone in the room with alphabets. But look, so here's the thing. I think the headline growth numbers look really nice. And they've in fact surprised a lot of us on the stage. And two things are really driving that. One is very strong urban consumption. The people there in this room are driving much of this growth that you're seeing. And the second aspect is that the government has gone hammer and tongs on public investment. So we've seen a huge surge of investments by the center across states. And the question that one has when one looks at, say, a 7.6, 7.7% growth is, well, if you take the government out of the picture, how does the growth scenario look? I guess the place where the unease kind of starts is that consumption growth is actually slowing. We've seen it go down from 6% to around 3%. We also have elections coming up. So the question is how much this public capex surge and how much the private capex that is linked to the public capex. If the government says builds a lot of roads, sure, there are some pockets of the private capex landscape that will react to this, but what happens when that slows down for a bit? And then the global growth situation next year is going to be quite worrying. I mean, the way I think about it is 2023 has been the PARP, and 2024 is going to be the Prayashchit. Right? 2023, we saw interest rates being raised across the world by 500, 550 basis points. That's the action. The reaction is going to happen next year, possibly in the second half. And we really don't know how that will pan out, whether we'll have a soft landing, a hard landing, recession. And those are going to be headwinds for the Indian economy in the near term. Medium term, we have a positive outlook.
Well, when COVID happened, we were told 2 months. Then we were told 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. I'm wondering that every time we have conversations like this, a new, stretch goal comes out. But you're not to blame for that. I'm going to come to you, Indranil. And before I do that, I just want to share some data for all of you here in the audience. We've just put it together. What's the way to describe the current status of the Indian economy? Various people say it is a binary economy where there is a divergence between the rich who are getting richer and the poor who perhaps are getting poorer. Let's look at these two divergent trends in terms of rural India. Rural India accounts for 40% of overall FMCG market. We have seen a noticeable drop due to inflation and monsoon. But pre-pandemic, Bharat was growing much faster. Mobile phones, 30,000 plus mobile phones flying off the shelves. Below that, the so-called affordable budget segment, not. Now, the argument could be that premiumization is happening in the Indian economy. But when you take this argument to the real estate sector, there you see affordable housing. I don't know how many of you have seen affordable housing advertisement in the last 2 years. The Delhi Development Authority has come out, the most recent auction is an auction, it's not an allotment, and it's a 5 crore home in the outskirts of Delhi, not a big price point. I could keep going on. 500,000 homes this year, and most of them are premium. The same could be said about travel and hotels. It's impossible to get a decent room for a decent rate. So that was the context really. Sorry for setting that long context. Do you agree with this, that at the macro aggregate level, it's perhaps a V could be a W, but when it comes to sectors, different sectors are showing a different growth trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, that is always the case where you have different sectors growing at different paces. I think right now, rural is clearly seeing a slowdown. When you look at the Kharif crop, which just went by, we are looking at farm income contract by 3.5%. You are seeing Narega, demand at a peak, if you take out the COVID years. So a lot of the consumption demand is being borne by coming from urban India. And it is true that, there has been a K-shaped recovery. This is just not in India, it's all over the world. We do these surveys which clearly show that, the recovery has been much faster at the higher levels of income than the lower levels.
And sorry to interrupt, you are saying this is a global feature and nothing unique to...
It's a global feature. It's happened across the world. I don't think there is any country which has not seen a K-shaped recovery, because that's been the very nature of the recovery that we have seen. So I would say that, there are three challenges that we face. Because the US has been raising rates, lending rates in India have shot up. And because the repo rate and the EBLR are linked, rates at the lower end and the weaker sections have gone up more. If you look at housing demand that you said, normal mortgage loan growth is very high, but when you look at affordable housing loan growth, that is almost close to zero. Now, linked to that is the fact that external demand is weak, and then the rural issues that we spoke about. Hopefully, the Fed is done, and, I think that the rate cycle can start to turn, pretty fast. We are calling for RBI rate cut in February. If the Fed tonight or on 31st January says that it is done, so maybe we start to see relief as we go forward.
Sachchidanand, what are the implications of what the two speakers before you, and I'm sort of paraphrasing for them, soaring high end and a falling low end? What are the implications going forward? Because we are on the cusp of 2024, and he referred to how next year is likely going to be. What, in your view, are the implications?
So, Siddharth, I think if you look at people who don't know which port they're headed to, no wind is favorable, right? You look at the global economy and the way things are, multiple shocks to the system. That is the backdrop. That remains the backdrop. But even as I say that, global VIX is at less than 12, which is, I think, Jan 20 levels. And the point I'm trying to make is the backdrop is such that the Indian economy or the story is going to be a standout one, simply for the reason that you need to look at the next 5-year growth projections, right? This backdrop that provides us. At the current juncture, global economy is going to grow at less than 3%. Now, that sounds like a decent number, but it is down from 4.9, which is way higher, and this is the lowest since 1990. In the same time frame, India has been one of the fastest growing economies for at least 7 odd years, and if IMF projections come true for the next 5-year period, India will be the fastest growing economy in 11 out of 15 years since 2014, for which the IMF has that data. So I think you need to look at how the economy is doing in midst of these global shocks. So once in a century shock, COVID, and the digitization story comes into play. You have people attacking the Capitol building in the US, for example. And here in India, we've had 9 state elections and all these transitions are so smooth, right? So this is a complete contrast. We have growth with stability, political stability, and certainty. Now, what this does, and you're talking about India and Bharat, mind you, the definition of Bharat has changed now, right? So please be careful how you use it. But the point I'm making is the denominator makes a hell lot of a difference. And if you were to look at, say, just 6% growth for the next 5 years, which the IMF is talking about, add 4 or 5% inflation, 11% nominal growth is a huge number. And if you use that rule of 72, this is an economy that's going to be doubling every 6.5 years. And that is massive. And that's just the denominator. And there will be sectors and companies which will grow much faster than this. So I think this is the global backdrop. And even the rates, for example, the Fed might do whatever, as Indranil said. In India, the rates are still back to where we were just before the pandemic, right? So they're not restrictive. And therefore, we are probably in a Goldilocks period where whatever the rest of the world does, that 6 to 6.5% real and 11% is going to do wonders going forward.
So imagine, and as he put it, 6.5 and maybe even 7% is something that most countries across the world, the developed economies, would give an arm and a leg for. Now let's come to another much more pressing concern, and this is not just an Indian phenomenon, this is inflation. And we'll try and demystify it for a broader audience and not just talk about the dry numbers. First question, and I'll try and do it as quickly. I'll request you to do a rapid fire. Will prices ever come down in India? Cheezein sasti hongi? Is there any possibility of that happening?
The big difference is price or inflation.
Okay.
Because inflation is the growth of prices, right? For prices to actually come down, that's deflation.
Okay.
Will deflation happen in India? Very unlikely.
No.
If you're talking of 7% growth and 11% nominal GDP growth, we are a growing economy, and neither should we aspire for deflation. So as much as people like cheap things aren't great for the economy. Will inflation come down? Now, here's what really puzzles me, Siddharth, is that we are supposedly growing at 7%. Yet our core inflation, right? This is the demand-driven inflation. This is the inflation that comes when you go to buy a refrigerator or when you're buying clothes, etc. That core inflation is tracking at almost multi-year lows of 4%. And I think
is that a data issue?
I don't think so. And it can mean two things. One is that input costs have fallen quite a lot for Indian manufacturers. And second is maybe growth isn't as strong as we believe, because firms don't have that pricing power. But I think the bigger risk for India and for a number of emerging markets is actually twofold. One is food, and I think we are increasingly seeing the impact of climate change on food inflation. Indranil just mentioned, Kharif production this year has been really low, right? We've had the El Nino impact. So food inflation is a risk. And the other one is oil. And I know that oil prices are low now, but geopolitical risks are very much now part of base cases. And when that happens, food and oil, especially for an emerging economy like India, I think are the biggest risks.
Well, the fuel price impact is being managed. It is being borne by the center and the oil marketing companies, and very clearly till the election, and perhaps beyond that, that might be so. And in fact, it's a separate subject, but perhaps the daily price movements regime may have been soft abandoned for the time being. But I'm coming to you. And on that point, really, the first faint signs that corporate profit margins are coming under pressure seem to be emerging. It's not a broad-based trend, it is selective. Is that something you agree with, and does that add to the point that he is referring to in terms of corporates and their pricing power?
Yeah, I think to some extent, as inflation comes down, this is bound to happen. You can see it either way. You can see it as a loss of pricing power. You can see it as a overall phenomena of inflation coming down because the RBI has a tight monetary policy. I think inflation is last year's story. this year inflation will come off. Core inflation is, obviously 3.5%, which is why I think that, if the Fed is done, the RBI can start to cut rates.
Okay, so the cost of money is likely to go down perhaps
It
6
should.
months later.
It should start going down, the moment the Fed says it's done. And if you look at the Fed, core CPI inflation is somewhere around 3.5%. They're sitting at 5.5%. 2% real rate in an economy whose potential growth is 1.8% is very, very high. So it remains to be seen how long this sustains. And once the Fed is done, there is no reason whatsoever for the RBI to sit at 6.5%.
This feature of our economy today is not fully appreciated, the linkage with what the US Fed does. And barely a handful of Indians would know what that creature is all about. Yet, most ordinary Indians who consume anything at a certain level and above are impacted by such decisions which happen very far away, happen in the dead of Indian Standard Time. Do you buy the argument that he has?
So I would probably argue that the sensitivity that we've had typically over the last, say, 30 years with respect to, say, global prices of three essential things: crude oil, the dollar, and the US treasuries, right? This economy has changed and transformed in ways which has lowered the sensitivity of each one of these. So just to give you an example, we've had...
Paisa hai, kharcha karenge. Is that what you're saying?
Yes and no. So I'll just come to that. Slightly
Okay.
more nuanced. If you look at what's happened in the Middle East, right? A Six Sigma sort of an event. Crude oil prices went up for a bit and then came down. Last year we've had that Russia-Ukraine war. Crude oil prices went to 130. Nothing really changed to Indian growth story in terms of growth, the rupee dollar rate, or even the interest rates. Typically, if you had told me 20 years back, 10 years back, that this is what's going to happen and the US Fed is going to raise rates by 550 basis points in just about 12 months, crude oil going to 130, two wars and stuff like that, rupee would have tanked dramatically, right? Interest rates would have gone up dramatically. Our growth story would have suffered, but it hasn't really played out.
So who do you credit for this?
Multiple things. I think the first thing I would say is the denominator story, right? I mean, we don't really understand the power of compounding. We've heard that in the market parlance. But when it comes to the GDP, which is the aggregate of all our incomes, right, all of us, 10, 11% nominal can do wonders over time. And we are seeing this. So our oil sensitivity, for example, has gone down over time. Similarly, the way the Fed reacts, it's the marginal provider of liquidity to the world, rest of the world. Now, 5.5% in 12 months, and the RBI has not had to follow them like they would have had to otherwise. And similarly for so many other things. So while, yes, we are linked to the rest of the world, but the sensitivity has changed dramatically. And just let me give you one statistic. We are conditioned to think that China is the larger economy and export story of the world. If I were to ask you, in 2022, for example, or the last couple of years, which has been the largest, say, exporter to the rest of the world? I think many of you would be surprised to know that India overtook China in terms of export to GDP. And I'm combining goods and services, right? 22.5%. And not many people notice this. So there are multiple things that have changed. And this is just one statistic that I want to highlight. So our sensitivity has changed fundamentally, and it will change further as well.
How much credit will you give to policy stability, policy certainty, the fiscal side, and how much to the monetary side as far as India's economy is concerned?
I mean, Sachchidanand mentioned how the rupee doesn't react. And that's because we have, a Mahendra Singh Dhoni type of wicketkeeper in the name of the RBI. It's hardly let the rupee, go. It's been intervening very aggressively. So, okay, so I think there is a big role of policymakers in all of this. First, on the government side, a few years back when the pandemic struck, most of the Western economies panicked and ran huge fiscal deficits, saying that, oh my God, this is the apocalypse. We are going to let our fiscal go loose. And the Indian government has actually been far, far more prudent. And a lot of people at that point said, hey, why have you not spent so much? People are suffering, etc., etc. But what's happening now is that those chickens are coming home to roost. And say in somewhere like the US, they are battling high inflation because essentially households just took that money, kept it in their pocket, and so now they're sitting on excess money, and inflation isn't going down, and now it's become a monetary policy problem. So to that extent, I mean, the fiscal discipline that this government has shown, I think is absolutely fantastic. And even things like, for instance, Prime Minister Modi recently announced the free food scheme, right? And it might sound populist, but if you open Excel sheets and do the math, spending 0.7% of GDP odd per year is roughly what we normally also spend on food subsidy. It might be marginally a bit higher. So this is an instance of how, while the face might be populist, the fine print is actually pretty prudent. On the RBI side, I think the governor appreciated, and I won't really blame RBI for this, right, because all central banks had this problem. They didn't realize how permanent inflation is going to be. So they were all very risk averse, and then they started hiking, right? And then again, RBI didn't, it stopped at a point, and it said, look, 6.5% I think is fine because I don't want to kill growth in the process of killing inflation.
Right. Indranil, if Modi-nomics has worked as far as the fiscal side is concerned, would it be fair to say that the RBI governor has written a new chapter of Das Capital?
Well, I think that, I would credit three men in the RBI. I myself worked in the RBI at the beginning of my career. So I think it was Bimal Jalan who began the policy of building FX reserves. In 1998, I was a part of the team that raised Resurgent India bonds. So that is number one. Then came Dr. Reddy, who advanced that policy, and we began to build very, very high FX reserves, which stood us in good stead during the GFC. And I think after that, Mr. Das has again, been building almost, I think, $150 billion. So I think these three wise men have a tremendous contribution, in what now I call the Bharat story. Okay. So I would really say that, see, when you have FX reserves, you are protected from global shocks. So, we used to say that like you have an army for external aggression, you need high FX reserves for external stability. In 2013, you saw what happens when you don't have enough FX reserves. And when you don't have FX reserves, you try to sell, you look even weaker. When you have FX reserves, no one comes to mess with you, and you can do things at your own pace.
That's a very interesting take, and comparing a standing army with a massive sort of war chest in terms of forex reserves is a good point that you make. I'm coming to you, Jazanan, and on the point that is enough credit being given to RBI Governor Shaktikanta Das, not only for what the others on the panel have said, but also bringing a sense of calm to how the RBI is managed in public perception, and also the relationship between Mint Street and North Block.
So I would think personally that Mr. Das has done wonders in terms of what was expected from him. I mean, everything works in relation to the expectation, and when he came in, you know how things were, and the discord between the finance ministry and RBI was probably at a peak. And therefore, the set of expectations were very, very different. Looking at that, and also what really transpired later on, I mean, the COVID shock and multiple global events, I think he's done a phenomenal job. But I think we must also give credit to the governments and the fiscal arms. Things like Monetary Policy Committee, the IBC, some of those reforms really have institutionalized the practices of the developed world, which are now leading to a point where inflation has been under control remarkably. So I gave you those instances.
Right.
But look at our headline inflation, or even core for that matter. Typically, the bugbear of any emerging market, or India typically last 20, 30 years, has been any global shock and your rupee goes for a toss and interest rates really shoot up. And that raises the hurdle rate for investments, right? So you are a very, very volatile economy. What the governments have done via these reforms, and these are not the only reforms, multiple other reforms, they have brought in a sense of calm, that the phrase that you used, in terms of our interest rates, currency movements, and things like that. And that makes us a far more stable economy in a VUCA world. And that makes us a standout story.
Absolutely. I won't say oil on troubled waters, but perhaps jasmine oil on troubled waters. Okay, we are running out of time, so I'll take 30 seconds with each of you. This is the big worry. We are now heading into the general election. And in the run-up through state elections, we saw fears and the debate around the Revdi culture. How big a risk is that to our overall macroeconomic and fiscal stability in the year ahead, including, for example, the demand for OPS, the old pension scheme? Very quickly.
Left unchecked, it's a huge problem. But the fact that the BJP has managed to win the state elections, see, the major differentiator between the opposition and the BJP seems to be that, I'm going to give a little more Revdi. And if you look at the manifestos of the BJP in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, etc., it's almost, if you put that manifesto and the Congress manifesto, they're almost similar, right? So there is that push. But the point is that given that they have won these elections, and hopefully that should give them a sense of self-confidence that, you don't really need to appease as much. I think this government has a good track record of fiscal prudence to not do an overkill there.
Okay. The same question to you.
So I think that, I will take you back to 2019 when the opposition had announced universal basic income scheme. And the Prime Minister did not, follow, right? I mean, he took a political risk. So I think there is, an inherent commitment to some kind of fiscal discipline that, the Prime Minister has demonstrated despite having an election fight just in front of him. It's but natural that before elections, there will be a step up in welfare measures, especially at a time when, you have a rural stress, but that's fine. I think that as long as our fiscal deficit is somewhere around 7% or so combined, and growth is 11%, there is no problem of debt sustainability. The fiscal deficit is now somewhat higher, but these are, stressful times.
The same question to you.
So I think when it comes to the defined versus undefined pension contributions, it's empirically proven, and we have enough records globally, that it's a recipe for disaster, typically, right? But I think we need a far more nuanced debate on the rest of the things. What the sovereign at the national level does and what the sub-sovereigns or sub-national level. In a democracy, this needs to be debated, especially when we are going from 3-4 trillion to 10 trillion size. I think this needs a far wider nuanced debate, wider debate. And I think the monetary policy and the fiscal side and the states, we need a much deeper debate on this. And there is this concept in economics called merit versus non-merit goods. So you can't say that, hey, I can do this, I'm entitled to do this as a sovereign at the national level, but you at the state level cannot do so. So I think we need, at this size of GDP, We need to do this. And mind you, we are like, 29 nations put together,
Absolutely.
30 people quarreling over this. We need a much nuanced debate on this.
And perhaps another session, another debate on that, especially the point that you are ending this debate today, which is the different economic strengths of each state. If every state were to come under pressure from those states who can afford more giveaways, for example, on pension, it would mean that states who are not so strong economically would suffer more. And the point that the central government, the union government and its finance and its ability to raise resources, that's a completely different framework. But we'll leave that for some other day, for perhaps the next BT500 debate. Thank you very much to my entire panel for their time with us today.